When are you supposed to water a terrarium? How often are you supposed to water it? How much water should you give it? These are all questions that I was asking when I started building terrariums on my own, and these are really important questions that you need to find out, or you could be making a huge mistake with your terrarium. Hey guys, it's Joe here, coming at you with another video from Hermit Garden. In this video, we're going to talk about how and when you should water your terrarium. For any beginner starting to build terrariums, watering is a common question that gets brought up. With any plant, there's three really important factors to consider. There's the soil, there's sunlight, and there's water. We're going to talk about that water component. So if you're coming from a background of indoor gardening, you have your traditional houseplants that you've been taking care of, and you're jumping into building terrariums, it might come as a surprise to you that you actually don't have to water your terrarium at all, at least for closed terrariums. Open terrariums, on the other hand, are a different story. They're more like your traditional houseplants, but we're mainly going to focus on closed terrariums in this video. And if you don't know what the difference is, basically a closed terrarium is completely sealed off. An open terrarium is like a traditional houseplant. The plants are just open to the air. Whereas in a closed terrarium, it's completely sealed off. No air can get in or out. No water vapors can get in or out. So let's talk a little bit about the design of a terrarium to help you understand why they don't need any water. So I've got my terrarium right here, and what you'll notice is that it's completely sealed off. It's got a red cap on here. There's no way air can get in or out, and water vapors can't get in and they can't escape. Why that's important to deciding when you should water your terrarium is because if it's completely sealed off, all the water that gets added to your terrarium when you first put it together is going to stay inside of that system. It's never going to escape. And what that means is anytime you add water to your terrarium, you're increasing the levels of water overall within the system. Whereas in a traditional houseplant, that water would normally evaporate and dry up, which is why you would have to come back and water your plants every so often. In a closed terrarium, that's not the case, because water will keep on recycling itself within the container, condensing on the walls of the container, trickling down into the soil, and then evaporating back up to repeat that cycle over and over again in a never-ending cycle. So with a closed terrarium, you actually don't have to add any water at all. But there are some cases when you might need to add water to it, or you might even need to take water out of the system. So let's talk about when you might need to water your terrarium. There's a couple ways you can tell your terrarium could use a little bit more water. The first way is to look at the condensation. So in a terrarium, a good sign of balanced water levels is that there is condensation in mornings and evenings, only at certain times of the day. But other than that, you don't see any condensation at all. If you don't see any condensation at all at any time throughout the day, that's a sign that your terrarium could use a little bit more water. And that can happen if you put your terrarium together and you just didn't add enough water to the terrarium to begin with. And so in that case, you might actually need to give it a little bit more water. The other way that you can tell, you can actually open up your terrarium and just feel the soil to tell if it's feeling a little bit too moist or it's feeling bone dry. If it feels bone dry, that's a sign it needs more water. Ideally, what you should be aiming for is a soil that feels slightly moist, but not soaking wet and not bone dry. The third way you can tell is by looking at the drainage layer. So if you set up your terrarium properly, you should have a drainage layer at the bottom. So in my terrarium right here, this is my drainage layer. And if you put way too much water in there, it'll be really obvious. You'll see if you tilt your terrarium to one of the corners like this, you'll actually see water start to pool up in here, forming a little puddle. And that's a big sign that there's probably too much water in your terrarium. So let me back up here a little bit. When it comes to water in a terrarium, it can actually be a pretty big problem if there's too much water in your system. Because what can happen with too much water is that it leads to what's called overwatering. And when a plant is overwatered, that causes the roots to start rotting. And that happens because water is actually suffocating the plant roots, preventing air from accessing oxygen, which it needs to perform respiration. And so it's pretty much like you're drowning your plants with too much water. And that causes the roots to start to turn black and gooey, and they start to have this rotting smell to them, which is definitely not something that you want. And if you don't notice it right away, your plant is going to show symptoms of overwatering, like yellow leaves, or just start to look unhealthy and droopy overall. And it could also lead to problems with mold growth. which is definitely not a pretty sight to have in your terrarium. And that's especially bad for succulents. And by the way, if you're growing succulents in a closed terrarium, you're probably not doing it right. Okay, so let's get back to the main topic here. How do you water your terrarium? So let me show you with my terrarium right here. So there's a couple of ways you can water it. So the preferred method of watering your terrarium is to get a mister. And a mister is going to evenly distribute the water throughout your terrarium so that all the plants get an even amount of water. And you're not having like a little pool of water in certain areas and while other areas are completely dry with no water. So I'm going to open this up and show you how you can mist it. Okay, so you can take a misting bottle. So this is a little spray bottle that I have. You can use this, one of those Windex type spray bottles if you want. Basically anything that will spray the water will work fine for this. So all I gotta do is give it a few spurts of water, like that. And you're pretty much good to go. So I want to make a really big point here. You definitely don't want to overdo that. It's really tempting to want to give your plants extra love by giving them a lot of water, but with closed terrariums especially, you want to be very careful not to give it too much water. Because compared to a traditional houseplant, that water is not going to evaporate. It's going to stay in the system and never leave. It's going to keep recycling within the container. And so you don't have that compensating factor of water evaporating from your plant to do a little bit of compensating for the extra water you're giving your plant normally. There's a couple of other ways you could water your terrarium. So another way you could do is to get a syringe and suck up a bit of water and just direct it towards the base of your plants that need the water. And that's a way if you want to be really precise and target where you're placing the water in your terrarium. And the third way you could do it is you can just get a bowl of water, dip your fingers in and just splash the water into your terrarium. That's another way you could spray the water droplets throughout your terrarium without actually having a spray bottle. So those are all ways that are equally fine at watering your terrarium. It just kind of depends on your preferences and what tools that you have available. And it also depends a little bit on what type of plants you have. So if you have plants that love high humidity and high moisture levels, then you can go a little bit heavier on the watering. But if you have plants that might do fine with a little bit less watering, like succulents, then you might want to ease up a little bit on the watering. And that's kind of why I think it's important to have a drainage layer in your terrarium. That kind of helps compensate for that overwatering by allowing water to drain away from the soil into the drainage layer, that space that you create with your drainage layer material. Because what that does is it allows excess water to drain away from the soil, away from your plant roots, and kind of protects them from being smothered by water if you give it too much water, just in case. So that's always kind of like a emergency backup situation that I like to keep in my terrariums. But that's pretty much it. That's pretty much all you need to know when it comes to watering your terrariums. I'd say if you want to optimize the care for your terrarium, you might want to pay attention to the condensation levels in your terrarium over time. Just monitor it, keep an eye on it, make sure that it's looking like a little bit of condensation throughout the day, but not having condensation 24/7 and at the same time not being completely dry 24/7. If you have something in the middle, that's probably gonna be a good sign that your terrarium is doing fine in terms of the water levels. But I'd say for most people, if you're completely hands-off, you set up the water levels correctly right away, then watering your terrarium isn't something that you'll need to worry about too much. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.